talk series that we've done in the course of the last quarter of this year, in any case, and into last year of 2020. This evening, we will be talking about Billy Wilder's The Lost Weekend. But before we get started, I just wanted to send out a happy International Women's Day to all of those that are attending. And we salute all of the talented and incredible women that come here and support us and that enjoy these old classic films as well, with all the great conversation and questions that you ask. Speaking of questions, before we get into Fred's talk, just wanted to do a little housekeeping for those of you that are new, although I do see a lot of familiar names in that list, which is fantastic. We, as the talk is going on, if you have any questions, you have at the bottom of your screen something that says Q&A. If you click on that and ask your questions, what I will do is I will screen those questions and get those over to Fred at the conclusion of his talk this evening, so we can have a good conversation about this particular film. Of course, this is the not-for-profit organization, Westdale, and of course, if you're entitled or you feel inclined, you can always go to the westdale.ca to the donate button and feel free to help us out in that regard as well. Without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to the board of directors, former film producer and president of American Zoetrope, Mr. Fred Fuchs, for our talk this evening. Fred?
Hi, good evening, everybody. So glad you were able to join us again. The Lost Weekend, 1945. Now, you know, I chose this film because it was obviously very, very celebrated at the time it came out and was very successful, even though very, very tough topic. And I'm really curious to hear what you guys thought of the film, because a lot of people haven't seen it, and for many good reasons, perhaps it sort of became lesser known over the years. And it's not, fun entertainment, the way some of the movies we've been watching are. But I think this is a film that really does some kind of amazing things and actually had, a lot of social value as well. And I'm always very interested in films that really impact society, and always am interested in the power of film and the power of media to influence people, inspire them, educate them. And I think this film did that, and obviously to touch them, and I found myself getting very emotional at different points in this film. So of course, as you know, Billy Wilder, the great writer-director, was responsible for this film, although he's mostly known for his comedies, Some Like It Hot, etc. He did everything. His Double Indemnity, a good example, a film noir. And in fact, that was in 1944, and this was 1945. This was the film he did right after Double Indemnity. Now, the film really started all because of the book. And this was a book called The Lost Weekend by Charles Jackson. And this came out in around 1944. Same name, though ironically, when Jackson wrote the book and he first submitted it to his publisher, it was called The Last Weekend. And there was actually an editorial mistake, I think, with the publisher who changed the title unknowingly to The Lost Weekend. But I think The Lost Weekend actually is a much more powerful title than The Last Weekend, so it all kind of worked out. And even though, and we'll talk a little more about Jackson, but of course the film, which everybody was kind of uncertain about because of the tough subject, went on to be nominated for 7 Academy Awards and won 4, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, and Best Screenplay. And in fact, Wilder won for Best Director and Best Screenplay, and that was the first time anybody had ever won for both of those categories. It also won the grand prize at the Cannes Film Festival. And there have only been 3 films in history that have won the Academy Award for Best Picture and the highest award in Cannes. And of course, this is one of them. One of them was 1955, a little known film called Marty, starring Ernest Borgnine. And then most recently, Parasite in 2019. But in the history of film, there are only 3 films that actually won both. So the novel is real, again, where it all began. And it was not an unsimilar story. It was, these 5 disastrous days in the life of this alcohol, Don Berman. And when it was published in 1944, it became a huge success, even though it had been rejected by a number of publishers and no one seemed to be all that interested in. But it was sold over 500,000 copies. It was translated into 14 languages and critically accepted as well. And I think that, of course, most of the comments were about this compelling gift to literature about addiction and the way the character in the book, they called it a masterpiece of psychological precision, and to use a narrative method to talk about this, very, very serious illness. So, of course, once the book started to gain popularity, people were all trying to figure out what it was and how did it come about and what could Hollywood do with it. And part of well, Jackson himself, of course, was an alcoholic. This was quite autobiographical. Though he wasn't the problem in the book actually didn't so much have to do with his frustration around writing a novel. It had to do with his homosexuality. And of course, all of that was eliminated in the screenplay. But just so you know, there was a whole kind of different challenges that the main character was facing in the book itself. But what people really wanted to know was sort of the secret, right? How did he stop drinking? How did he get this done? And of course, many of the Hollywood celebrities were alcoholics. Spencer Tracy, of course, a well-known alcoholic, hounded him for days on end, and even Herman Mankiewicz, from, of course, Citizen Kane and the movie Menka, also well known who had attempted suicide. They all wanted to know what was the secret. How did he stop drinking? The sad story, of course, is that after he did stop drinking, wrote this novel, and the novel became a huge success, he later on did start drinking again, became an addict again. Unfortunately, never had any other success except for this film and this book. But it really is an incredible story, and it really, most of the film is a tribute to Charles Jackson and to this original book. And then also, of course, the timing. So once again, 1945, and what's going on, right? Well, first of all, the whole concept of alcoholism as a disease, as a medical disease, was relatively new, right? Most of the issues around alcohol consumption were moral issues in the past, right? The Puritan American establishment who thought, drinking was, corrupted the youth. It was also moral issues. And prohibition, right, which went on from 1920 to 1933, almost 13 years, right, was really not about trying to help, with a medical problem. It was really this moral problem that could we, keep men from, and by the way, mostly it was men. Women were not often alcoholics at that time. There were some, but not in the same percentages as now. And that was really the focus of it. And in fact, when Prohibition ended in 1938, it wasn't because there was a change in Americans' perception about morality. It was a change simply, they wanted the taxes. They wanted the money. It was sort of like, legalizing, cannabis in Canada. It was like, that was the reason it was legalized. It wasn't because suddenly there was a moral change that somehow, alcohol was accepted. Remember, AA had only just started. AA technically started in 36, but it wasn't until 1939 that the book and the 12 steps, first came out, and people were starting to understand that the seriousness of this disease. And of course, remember in 45, again, the veterans were coming back and not knowing what PTSD is, and we've talked about this before, but many of them did start drinking, and alcoholism was very much on the rise. And by 1950, there were over 100,000 people who had, joined AA, were calling themselves alcoholics, searching for medical treatment rather than just looking at alcohol consumption as some kind of a social, kind of thing. And in fact, there is a moment in the movie, right, where when Don is taken to Bellevue, which is, of course, a very famous mental institution in New York, and the sadistic orderly, remember Bim? And he says, prohibition, that's what started most of these guys off, right? And he, and he makes some comment of narrow-minded small-town teetotalers, right? So, a lot of organizations have incorrectly thought this was a film that was actually going to promote or publicize drinking. Very, very confused. In fact, the studio really did support the movie. They refused to make any changes, except when it was released in Britain. They called it The Lost Weekend, Diary of a Dipsomaniac. And they actually produced a little trailer and had a disclaimer. Ladies and gentlemen, this, unusual subject for screen presentation. We've been requested to warn you of the grim and realistic sequences contained in this unique diary carrying such a powerful moral. So, very interesting times and context for this movie and when it came out. So what actually happened is Billy Wilder was about to get on a train in Chicago, and he bought this book, like at a kiosk, right? And by the time the train arrived in Los Angeles, he had read the book twice. He was definitely wanted to make a movie based on this book, even though he knew, it was going to be a very controversial subject and not, a comedic thing. But, and what he said was, not only did I know it was going to make a good picture, I also knew the guy who was going to play the drunk was going to get the Academy Award. Now, another inspiration for Wilder wanting to do this is he had just finished working with the great writer Raymond Chandler, who wrote the screenplay, of course, for Double Indemnity. And Chandler was a recovering alcoholic at the time, and they had a very stressful and tumultuous relationship writing the script. Chandler began drinking again. And people think that Wilder, very much made this film in part to sort of try to understand Chandler, understand alcoholism. Wilder was not a big drinker himself or an alcoholic. And that might have been very much part of the reason why he was drawn to this in the first place. And anyhow, quite an extraordinary thing. A few other important things happen for Wilder on this movie. There's a small scene where there's a hat check girl who I think you only see her arm, but Audrey actually became his wife. And he fell in love during this movie and married this woman who I think remained his wife for pretty much the rest of his life, right? Now, originally, Wilder wanted Jose Ferrara to star for Don, but he turned it down. In fact, many people did not want to be associated with this movie. Their first choice for Helen was Olivia de Havilland. She couldn't do it. She was involved in a lawsuit. Katharine Hepburn considered the role. Jean Arthur was considered for the female lead, but people were really very nervous about this and what was going to happen. And there was a lot of buzz. Cary Grant was considered. Gary Cooper was considered. And eventually, of course, the role did go to Ray Milland, which was a very unusual choice. Now, Ray Milland was a movie star. He was a British, actor originally and came to Hollywood and kind of had made a career for himself, playing in light comedies. He was a matinee idol, very good looking, but never considered a very good or serious actor. And of course, even Ray Milland was very reluctant to take on this part because Ray Milland was a near teetotaler. He didn't drink at all, right? And he was very concerned about being associated with a film like this. And his agents all talked to him, it would be career, suicide. But Wilder, kind of knew he wanted this guy. They had worked together. In fact, Ray Milland stars in a movie called The Major and the Minor, which was Billy Wilder's first directing effort. I believe it's with Ginger Rogers. Is that right, Jeff? Yeah, with Ginger Rogers. A wonderful comedy if you've never seen it. But again, traditional Ray Milland role. But Wilder just had this intuition about him and said, I think you can do this. I'm going to help you make this, do this. And he did. And, so this was really something. And again, you've probably seen him in good movies. He was in Hitchcock's Dial M for Murder. Of course, he was in Love Story, but anyhow, this was really the one great role in Milland's career. And Milland, grew up, in England, and he was in the army. He was a sharpshooter. He was a great horseman. He actually won some big awards for that. Came to America, had trouble finding acting. He was doing menial jobs, working for a bookie. He really was almost out of Hollywood completely. And he happened to be walking by the gates of Paramount Picture when a casting director saw him. This was in 1934. And an English actor had just gotten injured, and they needed someone that day. So they urgently hired him, replaced him. It was a film called Bolero. And based on that, he got picked up as a contract, actor for Paramount. And they, the way they did in those days, they started to develop him. And he was in some musicals, Three Smart Girls, as you mentioned, Jeff. And he played against Dorothy Lamour, which was and he made some wonderful comedies. Easy Living is a great movie of his. But anyhow, this is what it was. And of course, Milland's concern was, I don't know anything about alcoholism or drinking. So what he did was he went to New York with the author, Charles Jackson. And Jackson kind of took him around and showed him and introduced him to people. And, how are you supposed to act when you're drunk? Milland didn't even know, right? So they spent quite a bit of time doing different things in New York. And in fact, Milland actually, as part of his research, was allowed to spend the night in the actual psychiatric ward of Bellevue Hospital, where we actually, of course, see these scenes. And he found it, of course, extremely disturbing. And there, all the craziness that was shown was happening that night. And in fact, at 3 a.m, he decided to just leave, and he kind of walked out because it was such a crazy thing. And some cop found him walking down the street, and thought he was nuts, and was going to arrest him and put him in jail. And then finally, they took him back to Bellevue, and he explained what was going on. Milland, lost 10 pounds to play the role. They just did a lot of little tricks to try to get him ready to do this part. And I think obviously they did a great job, and some really interesting things happened. The film started with filming actually in New York City, which was not always done in those days. This could very easily have all been shot on the back lot. But Wilder thought it was very important to establish the location. And in fact, there were, a lot of hidden camera shots, with Milland just walking the streets. I don't know if you felt like I did, but there was sort of a wonderful naturalism to those exterior New York scenes that kind of grounded the movie in a way and took it out of being just a traditional kind of Hollywood, sets and Hollywood fake kind of reality. So, and again, he did great in the exterior, scenes. And then, of course, they came back to Los Angeles to shoot all the sets. And that, of course, was much more difficult for Milland. And Wilder wasn't necessarily known as a great director for actors, right? His great, skills were mostly in writing and of course in directing. But anyhow, somehow, some magic did happen. And at least in my opinion, Milland gives this absolutely extraordinary performance, which was not easy to do. There very easily could have tipped one way or the other. The co-star, of course, Jane Wyman. I don't know if you guys know her or not, but she had a very, long career, popular contract play, where again, with Paramount, and you might remember from Stage Fright and All That Heaven Allows. And she actually won an Academy Award for Best Actress for an incredible movie called Johnny Belinda in 1948. I don't know if you guys have seen that. And then later on, she became, the famous villainess in Falcon Crest. And one of her other claims of fame was she was the first wife of President Ronald Reagan before he married Nancy Reagan. Howard Da Silva, incredible character actor, Nat the bartender. great role, great performance. Again, I felt like he brought something more than just good acting. He brought this sort of authenticity to that character, and kind of had a sort of a realistic, dramatic performance you don't necessarily see that much at this time, where people were more Hollywood movie stars and playing Hollywood. He went on to a terrific career. One of my favorite parts is, of course, They Live by Night, the great Nick Ray movie. And then he did a lot of Broadway later in his life. He was in the original musical, 1776, and lots and lots of stuff. Of course, the photography I thought was extraordinary, very creative, and we'll show some slides and some images. It was John Seitz, who really did almost all of Wilder's great movies, starting with Double Indemnity and Sunset Boulevard, and he received an Academy Award nomination for this film, and especially famous that kind of character walking towards the camera in a daze as time passes camera effect. We'll talk about that later. The score was very, very important part of this film. I don't know how many of you were really paying attention to it, but it was done by Miklos Rosa, who received 17 Oscar nominations during his career, including 3. In fact, that year he was nominated twice because he also did the score for Spellbound. And he was sort of the head of music at Paramount for many, many years. And of course, this film score is also known for its being one of the first to actually use the theremin, which is that strange instrument that you hear that sort of has a wah-wah kind of effect, and became, it became very popular. Actually, a lot of people wound up using the theremin in scores, afterwards. But it may or may not have been the first time, because Rosa also used the theremin in Spellbound. And if you've ever seen that movie, you can't forget the use of the theremin. And in fact, David Selznick, the producer of Spellbound, wanted to sue Paramount because of the use of the theremin in the score, but he found out you can't sue anybody about an instrument, right? So that didn't happen. And then, of course, then there was the editor. Now, he's a guy who doesn't get a lot of attention. Again, Academy Award nomination. His name was Doan Harrison. And Harrison's association with Wilder started right at the very beginning, when Wilder was an immigrant and first come to the States and was working as a screenwriter in the 30s. But Harrison was a well-established editor. He was the editor of Midnight, which Wilder won in 1939, and Hold Back the Dawn. And of course, in order for Wilder to be the director of The Major and the Minor in 1942, his first directing, he, insisted that Harrison was the editor and sat by him, and he kind of learned everything he knows. What does Wilder say? I worked with a very good cutter, Doan Harrison, for whom I learned a great deal. He was much more of a help for me than the cameraman. When I became a director, I didn't have any technical knowledge. And it was really Harrison who taught him how to pre-plan, how to shoot, how to do protection shots, coverage, what coverage even was, all that kind of stuff. And Harrison worked with Wilder for 25 years on every single one of Wilder's films, all the way through The Fortune Cookie. So this is sort of an unusual situation, this kind of very close relationship between, a director and an editor, but not surprising again, because of course, as I said, Wilder really was not trained as a director or know how to direct. And you see Harrison's credit on Sunset Boulevard. And in fact, he actually became the associate producer later on Wilder's movies like The 7-Year Itch. But very interesting. So again, we talked about the decision to shoot in New York City and why that was so important. And, again, people on the street didn't even know a film was being shot because there were hidden cameras. Really made something interesting happen, I thought. And then, of course, they built a complete replica of this very famous tavern, P.J. Clark's, where Nat is the bartender and Charles Jackson used to go to all the time. And it was built on the back lot, but it was so realistically, it's so well done that all the actors on the back watch used to come over there after work to the set and drink at the bar for this movie, because it reminded them of how great it was in New York City, and the detail of that set is just fabulous. Everything was so authentically done, and so I thought that was very funny. So once the Lost Weekend was completed, it was shown to a preview audience, but the score hadn't been done yet. And the audience did not know what to make of it. They actually thought it might have been comedic, and they knew it was Billy Wilder. And, when you go to previews, you don't really, there haven't been any reviews or no trailers. So people started laughing during the movie. They thought it was actually supposed to be funny, it sort of had just an upbeat, jazz music temp track. So that made people really nervous. They were really nervous about the film to begin with. But then, of course, once Rose's score was in place, and then, of course, the change in the ending, which we'll talk about, the reaction was favorable. Although still, when the movie was released, Paramount only released it in very limited engagements, because they were still very concerned that the public would not accept this kind of dark story. But it was universally accepted, great reviews, audience loved it. They obviously took it wide, and it did extremely, extremely well. One of the things that unfortunately didn't happen, well, I guess we should talk about the ending a little bit, because in the ending, in the book, not so happy. He doesn't actually shoot himself at the end of the book, but the book ends with a very clear understanding that he's not going to get better. This woman may or may not stick around, but there is no easy cure for alcoholism. That time, as I said, 12 Steps was just starting. Different other medical methods for dealing with alcoholism were not that well accepted. And Wilder and Charles Brackett, the producer and Wilder's, co-screenwriter, really wanted somehow that Don was going to be cured by writing this novel, The Bottle, right, which we see him thinking about and talking about. And they actually shot an ending where, he, and I don't know the details, but as I understand it, he writes the book, The Bottle, it becomes a bestseller, it's like, there's a real happy ending, winds up with the girl, everything else. And of course, Charles Jackson was horrified, that this happy ending, on this book that obviously did very well, the way it was. Eventually, Wilder and Brackett agreed. They went back and reshot the ending, where, and again, I'm curious to see what your sense of the ending was, and what's the audience left to believe? For me, the ending, as watching it this time, seemed not one of the strongest aspects of the film. But again, I'm curious to hear what everyone else thought. Again, mentioned, Charles Jackson was a closeted homosexual. There was strong implication in the book that Don Berman was, but instead they decided to focus his problems more around his, writing block, or his inability to write, which obviously was more acceptable than the impression that this was a man torn between his sexual interest in men and, of course, this girlfriend. Liquor interests were very nervous about this movie, and in fact, they went to the gangster Frank Costello, and supposedly he was offered Paramount $5 million to buy the film's negative, and he was just going to burn it, so no one ever saw the movie. And I'm not sure if that actually happened, but Wilder's comment, of course, is if someone had offered him $5 million, I would have burned the negative. That was a lot of money in those days. So again, a huge success. This is, remember, these very small budgets, $1.2 million. You can see this was not an expensive movie to make. It made over, $11 million, at the box office, which was, incredible. And of course, it's been deemed a culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant film. When it was registered, it was described an uncompromising look at the devastating effect of alcoholism. It melded an expressionistic film noir style with documentary realism to immerse viewers in the harrowing experiences of an aspiring New York writer willing to do almost anything for a drink. When Milland won the Best Oscar at the Academy Awards, he actually gave the shortest speech in the history of the Academy Awards. He got up to the podium, to sort of waved and left, never said a single word. And unfortunately as well, none of the producer and writer and director, and again, 4 awards won, ever mentioned the author of the book. And I think that was something that obviously seemed really inappropriate. Later on, they apologized, Brackett apologized, but again, to me, this was clearly a film that the book was just about everything, and again, it won for screenplay, actor, director, and best picture. Did not win for cinematography, score, or editing. And the other very strange thing about the movie was that the man's name was Charles Jackson. And if you notice, there's a very prominent display based on the book, right on the main title card from the novel by Charles R. Jackson. And nobody to this day knows why they put the R in there. It really wasn't part of his name. It wasn't on the book or anywhere else. But, again, he was omitted from the conversation. And unfortunately, the rest of his life, everybody would come up and congratulate him for this wonderful movie, The Lost Weekend, though that became far more famous than his book, historically. So why don't we look at some of the slides? This is a good time to do that, Jeff, and we can talk a little more about it as we do. Do you want to put up the first slide for us? Okay. All right, so we start, of course, with this wonderful image. This was, again, kind of a visual effects shot, right? Because it started off panning across New York City. I don't know about you guys, but the print I was looking at had all sorts of movement issues. It was very jumpy. There wasn't a smooth pan across, but obviously you were panning from a real location to a set piece, which is this window piece. But of course, what a great image of this, of the bottle, but, kind of hanging, in a noose, out the window. Which is sort of obviously a metaphor for the story and really brings us into the film, I thought, in a very, very interesting and clever way. And these are the kind of little touches that Wilder was most famous for, using props in interesting ways and doing things like this. Second slide. So here we are. We see him arriving at a liquor store, right? And I found this interesting, again, great image. It's almost like you're already telling the audience without dialogue, here's a man sort of trapped and surrounded by alcohol, shooting across the bottles, shooting him between the bottles, giving the bottles, kind of more emphasis in the image than even the actor. So very interesting perspective. And again, this is, to me, when film is really great, when it's using images to tell the story and not just be completely dependent on dialogue. And again, all of these images, I think, really helped us get even deeper into this character and trying to understand his perspective and what was going on in his head. And then in slide 3, yeah, here he is at PJ Clark's, and we see him with Nat, Howard Da Silva, and he just stops for that one shot of Rye, and we're sort of entering into this gently a bit. We're not quite, I think we have a pretty good sense that this guy's an alcoholic, but it starts off fairly innocent. Next image. Yeah, and then of course, very clever, to show the remains of all the different shot glasses as the night clearly went on. And of course, his line there is great. Don't wipe it away, Nat. Let me have my little vicious circle. The circle is a perfect geometric figure, no end, no beginning. That's pretty great writing. Now, of course, people nitpick because the water stains from the glass wouldn't still be there. This image was a fake image, right? Because if he's been sitting there for 3 hours, they still wouldn't be wet stains from every single glass. But it's a movie. What can I say? Scene 4. So this is him returning from the concert. This is great. Don's missing. It's really a great, moment for Jane Wyman, great actress, as we've talked about, worked with Hitchcock. Also a great director named Douglas Sirk. I don't know if you guys know his work. He was a fantastic director in the 50s, made some great melodramas, Written in the Wind and things like that. And she had a long career, but and I think she did a serviceable job in this movie. I wouldn't say she's particularly wonderful. It would have been really interesting to see Jean Arthur in this part, or a Katharine Hepburn, but maybe they would have, taken too much attention away from Don's character. So maybe having a slightly lesser known actress was a good thing. I'm not sure. Number 6, please. Yeah. So this again is the desperate alcoholic hiding from Helen and from Wick, in his apartment. It's just a wonderful, very haunting image to me of a man who's, partially there. He's not even fully there. Again, what is this image trying to say? It's saying more than just I'm hiding behind a curtain, at least to me. It's speaking to sort of his presence as a person in the world, and his desire to really obviously withdraw and hide, and his inability to face his brother and his and his girlfriend, to even have a conversation with them, because nothing was more important than where was the next drink coming from. Next slide. Yeah, so this is, let's see, what is this? Oh yes, this is Gloria, Doris Dowling, the prostitute. I guess they couldn't call her a prostitute in those days. I guess she's just a nice girl who goes out with guys. But, she's this barfly call girl. I found their relationship kind of cute. And later, of course, she's important only in that, Don goes to her and she gives him some money. And now, curiously, it's also rumored Wilder was having an affair with Doris Dowling. And I think this may have been her first role. Maybe that's how she got the part. She's not a terribly great actress, but I think, she served the purpose of, in the plot of giving. And again, kind of showing that, that Don's not a bad guy. He's not an evil man. He's not trying to hurt anyone else. He's just, quite sick, right? And then we get to 8. And this is very strange, right? Because now we go into this flashback, right? And you remember this part where we go back to several years earlier, and we start to see how, Don first met Helen, where they have that kind of, mix up around the coats, and he's at the Metropolitan Opera performance, which is quite funny, of course, because, it's from Traviata, and it's the champagne aria, right? When everybody has their champagne glasses, and then we see this kind of strange, multiple version of his raincoat, and which raincoat's going to have the bottle in it. Perhaps a little stylized, maybe a little too clever, in my opinion, this whole little sequence, but it was an effort to try to perhaps do something a little more interesting than kind of the straight linear narrative that had been happening up until this point, right? And then the next slide. let's see. So yeah, this is, he's going to start to write this book, The Bottle, and he gets as far as the dedication, and that's really about it, right? And then in the next scene, he's really looking for any excuse not to write it, and he sees the matchbook, and then we get to the scene in the nightclub, right? And to me, that scene in the nightclub was just so hard to watch, but this is, I thought, one of Ray Milland's greatest scenes, right? To see this character, and you remember he kind of tries to steal the purse from the woman next to him, and then he gets discovered, and he has to admit that he was that he was a crook, and he did this, and he gets thrown out, and it's just makes your skin crawl, and again, he plays this so wonderfully because he doesn't get angry or belligerent. He's wallowing, I guess, in his own, in self-pity for himself. But it's just, I just thought there was a lot of nuance to that performance. So, really a difficult scene that I think he actually played quite well. And I just thought that scene was just amazing and humiliating and awful, and just a great part of the movie. And then slide 11. This is, when he's desperately looking for the bottle of rye. Of course, is in the ceiling lamp. And there's another great shot where we're looking at him desperately, looking for the bottle, and you're shooting up to him, and there behind him is the light. And we know he's hidden the bottle in the light, even though he can't remember it. So, it's only going to be a question of time, hopefully, before he finally finds it. But this is, again, him really, spiraling out of control, trying visually to capture what it must like to be, an alcoholic, to be drunk in this kind of way. And using this extreme close-up, for example, is one way they tried to do it. Slide 12, please. Oh, yeah. So this is, I think this is the shot that one critic was talking about, the drunk kind of staggering towards us. This is when he's desperately trying to find an open pawn shop. And of course, they're all closed because it's Yom Kippur, and he couldn't figure that out. And of course, the pawn shops were all operated by Jews. And he doesn't know what, and he just, and this again was sort of that documentary, real on the streets of New York, hidden camera stuff that I thought was very interesting and very well done in this film. And then the next one, yeah, so he winds up with his buddy Nat, and he does give him a drink because he gives him the typewriter, anyhow. And then, of course, this wonderful act of kindness from that. And later on, you remember, Nat shows up with the Don's typewriter, which he fixed up for him and stuff. So, there's just wonderful people in the movie trying to help this guy. None of it's going to help. And again, look at the mannerism, the body language. This is acting. This isn't, some guy who was an alcoholic, understood or knew this world. He really was creating a character based on what his research told him, but bringing, I thought, this kind of open, emotional, honest truth to a character that, I think was, really, really compelling. Next slide. So this, of course, is in Bellevue with the, slightly sort of sadistic BIM nurse. And, why did you put me in alcoholic ward? Are you kidding? We had a peek at your blood, straight Applejack, 96 proof. And this actor actually, Phelan was more of a comedic actor, from vaudeville and stuff. But, and yeah, what else? It's like the doctor was just telling me delirium is a disease of the night. Good night, and all these kind of, it was a wholly bizarre sequence. And Bellevue, of course, was a real place. I think it still exists. And that is very much where they took it. And in fact, very famous, alcoholics and drug addicts too, later on it became a drug treatment center for drug addicts in the 60s and 70s. Next one. Yeah, so here he is again. He's going to steal her coat to get the pistol. He's just, really, at the end. And, I don't know. Again, it was tough to watch this movie, I found. The next shot is, yeah, so here we have another close up. Oh, I'm sorry. This is when, when Helen shows up and tries to help him. But, at this point, there's not much she can do either, though I guess she does kind of save the day, the way the ending works. The next shot is, the suicide note with the gun in the frame. This all became, to me, a little melodramatic. It didn't kind of feel like it had the same emotional truth as earlier in the film. And another one, oh yeah, this is behind the scenes production still. Again, shot in New York, and real people. These weren't extras, wandering on the streets. Is that right, Jeff? Where did you find this shot? I'm curious.
Yeah, it was from the American Film Institute, Fred, and there are moments throughout the film where you can see he's, the camera is scrolling down the street, and people are looking at the camera on occasion throughout the film, so it lends to that authenticity a bit.
In fact, there's one famous moment where they had a wonderful take of him coming, and then some fan ran into the shot to ask for his autograph, and they had to cut it. It ruined the take. But that's what happens when you try to do things more spontaneously and on the run like that. Okay, so anyhow, I'd love to hear from you guys. So we're back to full screen, and Jeff, I'm curious. Were the things you particularly noticed watching it this week you want to comment on? Or
Well, I had a question for you, and it's, I've seen this film associated with film noir. Do you believe it ends in that canon, Fred? Does it belong there?
I don't personally think it's a film noir, because even though I think visually it did borrow some film noir, and certainly Sights and Wilder just done Double Indemnity. But when you think about what the story is, the story does not fit into what is normally known as a film noir. I mean, yes, I guess you could call him an anti-hero. He's not a traditional hero, but there's no narration, there's no and there's no crime really, and most of the great film noirs do have some involvement with a crime story of some sort, and also some sense of sort of a moral questioning as to who's a bad guy, who's a good guy, and can people reform and can they not, and I think one of the geniuses of this film, and obviously the book, was that it was very single-minded in terms of what this was about. None of the other characters really mattered one way or the other too much, and this was really just a deep dive into something that's still a serious problem in our society. But in 1945, people didn't really talk about alcoholism, and they certainly didn't talk about it as a medical issue. They talked about it as again, a moral issue. But so I think this was a very important film in that respect, and again, the timing of 45, and again, I think it took years. And I'm not a doctor, I'm no expert on alcoholism, but from what I understand, the statistics are still enormous. 1 out of every 5 people, or every family has an alcoholic in it, and it's such. And now, of course, you could spread that to addiction, to drug addiction as well, and it touches so many people in so many sectors as well. It's not just poor people or middle class or rich people. It's really across the board, and such a sad, serious thing. And so this, again, making a movie like this was a very brave thing to do, and could have really hurt Wilder's career. But he was, a real artist, and I think he was trying to say something in this film and bring attention to something important. And I think he did a great job.
We were having a conversation on the weekend when we were watching it, and I was thinking about how drunkenness was depicted in movies before this film. And just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
No, I mean, it was mostly comedic, right? I mean, it was, comedies. We're always full of drunks, and Ernst Lubitsch movies. And of course, even when you go back to the silent films and if Charlie Chaplin had one drink and then he would be a drunk, and so it was meant to be, entertaining. And I'm sure there were films that dealt with alcoholism more seriously. And certainly after this film, there have been some fantastic, one I would highly recommend if you've never seen was called Days of Wine and Roses with Jack Lemmon and Lee Remick. Is that right? Yeah, that's a fantastic movie about alcoholism and late 50s, I think, later. But this, I can't think of any film before this that really treated this as a serious. Most people, Bogart, they all just drank, everybody drank, it was just sort of like, it was a social accepted thing. And the idea that, because remember, there are a lot of people who can drink without becoming alcoholics. It's not everybody who drinks is an alcoholic. Alcoholism is a very specific, medical condition, not just, and the whole thing with the DTs and all of that. I mean, it was, the bats and the mouse, and maybe it was a little bit of hyperbole there, but, at the same time, Wilder was trying the best he could to at least portray, as he understood it, the reality of how bad and how awful and horrifying these experiences are, and how hallucinations are not uncommon. They do happen.
I've been doing a little research, and I saw that this film was making its rounds in the homes of executives at the time, and it's one of the main reasons why it really did get out there in the public. Was they saw that there would be a morality story here, and that they thought there was an audience for it.
And also, a lot of them were alcoholics, and they were probably trying to figure out, is there a cure here, that I should know about? What is this telling me? And it was probably a scary wake up, call for some of them. But most of these guys, especially the actors, and were pretty heavy drinkers. And it was party, Hollywood, the social scene. It was. Alcoholism wrecked more than many careers, and so yeah, there was a lot of fascination about the subject, about the book, of course, first, and then the movie, and I don't know if it really changed anything, but I do know that certainly this was really when AA was really starting to catch on. Was in the again, I'm no expert, but maybe someone in the audience knows more. But the book came out in '39, by Bill Self, and in the '40s, it really started to pick up speed and became international.
Well, let's go to the Q&A here. Kathy Cousins asks, was this initiated by the results of the World War II? You kind of mentioned this previously, the PTSD effects of battle and alcoholism.
Well, again, I don't think that's what initiated this film originally. In fact, if you notice, there's no mention of the war, because the film is actually taking place in the late 30s, right? This is not a contemporary 1944 movie. It's really not set in a particular time, but there's no mention of the war, and there's no mention of the impact of the war. In fact, next week, we're going to be watching The Best Years of Our Lives. And that came out in 1948. And the entire movie is about the impact on these soldiers and their return to society and how difficult and challenging it was. So, stay tuned. There's a part two to this kind of, these two movies do sit well together. But here, no, this was not something consciously done in terms of the creative work in making up the film. But I do believe that in terms of its reception, both from the critics and from the audience themselves, there was an awareness of the fact that these soldiers were coming back. A lot of them were struggling to and as you'll see in Best Years of Lives, to re-engage with their family, to re-engage, and were experiencing PTSD, and their only solution was turning to alcohol, right? And they would drink and pass out, and that was one way to avoid these night terrors. So, but it was not really Wilder's focus, was on the soldiers.
And you've talked about this before from Jeff Duncanson, but I thought I would kind of frame this a little differently. And he's also referring to the ending being a bit of a cop-out. it's not really holding its water. But he's wondering, it makes a reference to the Hays Code insisting upon a happy resolution. Do you think there was any influence?
Yeah, I'm not sure it was the production code was still very much in effect at that time. But this is a case where I'm not sure. I don't, in my research at least, I didn't read anywhere that this was specifically done to appease the production code. I think this was actually more, and it was Wilder and Charles Brackett. This wasn't something that really came from the studio bosses. These guys had a lot of independence. They had made a lot of good movies by then. But I really think it was their concern that the film was dark and kind of relentless, and that the audience would be, just wrung out if there wasn't some glimmer of hope given at the end of the film. But I'm not sure the hope is justified or the hope is really explainable. And suddenly, after all these other attempts, Helen and finally convinces, that's it. Okay, I'm going to stop drinking. I mean, but I don't think it was a production code issue.
Thanks, Fred. Jeff also asks, why do you think Wilder worked best on collaborations? His most notable work seemed to be collaborative writing with Brackett, i.e. L. Diamond.
Well, all of his writing was collaborative. And as I understand it, and you know a little bit about this too, Jeff, what Wilder's great genius was sort of structure. He was very good with character and structure and narrative and wonderful little twists and plots and everything else, but he wasn't terribly good with dialogue. Remember, he only learned English when he was 30 years old. He didn't feel that confident with capturing the voice of characters, especially female characters, writing them effectively. So he always worked with another writer, and who was very good with dialogue, particularly I.A. Diamond was fantastic, or even with Raymond Chandler, on Double Indemnity. Raymond Chandler wrote all the dialogue. Well, actually, a lot was from the book too, but wrote all the dialogue. So Wilder was very smart, and he was also one of those classic guys who really wrote together, with his writing. Sometimes, writing teams, one guy writes something and then they share it and then they pass it back and forth, but they would write in the same room. And Wilder would just pace up and down, and the other guy would be sitting at the typewriter, typing it all in, because I don't think Wilder knew how to, sat at the typewriter. So there are many writers who do much better in a collaboration with another writer. You see so many screenwriting partnerships like that, but it was absolutely true with Wilder. And in fact, the breakup with Brackett, was kind of, well, that's a whole nother story, but it was kind of tragic. But it opened new avenues for Wilder with I.A. Diamond. So it was all good.
On that same vein, and it's from one of our anonymous attendees, did Wilder do any independent research on how alcoholism ravaged lives, or was he just using the book as a source, do you think?
I don't know. I'm pretty sure he was not an alcoholic himself. He was kind of a good family man, as much as any of these guys were. And of course, I think really, as I said, I think most of that is a tribute to Charles Jackson in the book. And Jackson, as I said, worked with Ray Milland, and actually took him to New York and showed him around and educated him a little bit about drunk behavior and things like that. So I don't know, but it's possible, of course. I'm sure he did do other research, but I'm not sure I know the answer.
We have a production question from Michelle Harris. What are protection shots?
Oh, protection shots. Well, that has to do with when you come to do coverage, right? So you shoot a scene, and there's always some concern, especially at the time of censorship, that there may be something that will be censored or will have to be removed, or even if there's a performance of a line of dialogue that's particularly bad or something else. So often what we have to do is called protection shots. And in fact, later on, what we used to have to do was, shots for television safe versions, right? So if we shot a movie and there was, dialogue that was, cursing, it wasn't going to be able to make the cut for TV, right? It was going to have to be cut out. Then you'd have to do a second version of it with them not swearing or saying some other language instead. So really the protection shot of the idea of coverage, and sometimes it was just shooting reaction shots of an actor that could be cut in at any time just to kind of cut down a scene. So supposing an actor has a very long speech and you're worried that, ultimately it may not be that interesting. You're going to want to cut the speech in half or a third. Having protection shots or coverage shots of other actors to cut away to is going to give you that ability later on to be able to have flexibility in editing. So really that's what this is about. It's about trying to create the flexibility in editing. And again, now some directors oppose that because they would be concerned that the studio would edit the movie the way they wanted instead of the way the director wanted. But most of the directors were savvy enough to know that nobody really knows when you're shooting a movie what's working or not. So better to have, some coverage and protection shots when you go to the editing room.
Cool. Thanks, Fred. With reference to your comment on how alcohol was depicted previously, this is from Jeffrey Eden, incidentally, I thought of the implied cocaine use in 3 on a Match, which, pre-code. I would wonder about the effect of the code on this.
Well, as I said, I don't know. I from the research and the reading I did, I'm not sure there was a lot of, again, as I said, in England, they put a disclaimer on the movie because they were worried people were going to, be, or whatever, that they weren't prepared for what this film was going to be about. And that it would be too difficult a subject for them to deal with. But I think, with the production code, their main concern was really around sexuality, around violence, around, unfaithful marriages or corruption. This film really didn't move into those territories. It was, in a way, it really was, showing alcoholism is the horrible thing it was. So, from a morality aspect, why would the production code have a problem with that? And the fact that there were horrifying moments, well, maybe that's okay. It's a horrifying subject. It should be presented that way. So I don't think there was much interference at all at that point.
More of a statement or a comment, but I know we were speculating about alternative casting, and Lindy Aubin mentions Hepburn's movie persona would not have put up with Dawn's shenanigans in real life. But in real life, she would have, because...
But it was Spencer Tracy.
Correct, exactly.
Who wasn't just a raging alcoholic who would never marry her because he was Catholic, but he was also heterosexual. He'd get drunk and, have sex with men. And, he was not a pleasant human being, but she put up with him for a long time.
There are stories about him being on a bender, pardon my last name, but in which she would not leave his side. He was incredibly belligerent and pretty terrible at times. So
yeah. So, but I agree with you. I don't think Katharine Hepburn would have been very effective in this part. And probably just as well she didn't do it. But and also when I hear those stories or read those stories, you don't really know how close or not it came. Jean Arthur, on the other hand, I could see in this movie, and I think she would have done, she could have done a great job in that part. But
let's see. Anonymous attendee also mentions that the film's representation of alcoholism, or at least drinking, was very deliberate. Was this direct approach common in films from that period? The impression is that today's films make the audience work harder.
Yeah, no, I think this was very unusual for that period. I think it's a good question, and I do think that the subject matter was sort of new to be treated in this kind of dramatic fashion instead of a comedic fashion. And I think Wilder did feel an obligation to try to portray it, in a way that would create for the audience an experience of what it might be like to be an alcoholic. So he was trying every way he could with camera and the dialogue and scenes to put you into Don's shoes, and try to have you be able to experience and feel what Don was feeling. And at times, it certainly, I think, got a bit melodramatic, and certainly, the scene with the bats and the mouse, I think we could have lived without. But this was really, a concern that otherwise audiences just wouldn't get it, and they wouldn't understand what's the big problem. Just stop drinking, and so I think it was a challenge because this was sort of new territory, and finding that balance, because this could have very easily tipped over, too far in the other way, was really one of the great geniuses of what Wilder was able to pull off in this film.
Andrew Martin asks, Fred, have you ever ate or drank at Billy Wilder's in Berlin?
No, I've never, unfortunately, I've never have. Yeah. Is that still going? Is it still going strong there?
That I don't know. I've not been to Berlin, unfortunately.
I don't know it either. But yeah.
I also wanted to mention before we wrap up this evening that there were 4 other really strong contenders that year, and they were Anchors Away, directed by George Sidney, Spellbound, which you mentioned previously, directed by Hitchcock, Mildred Pierce by Michael Curtiz, and The Bells of St. Mary's, Leo McCarey.
Well, Bells of St. Mary's, remember the year before, was Going My Way.
Right.
So that won all the awards. And Bells of St. Mary was the sequel with Bing Crosby, though it did add Ingrid Bergman, who's fantastic in that movie. And I actually think it's a better movie than Going My Way, but that's why it got eliminated. And Hitchcock was always never really that well appreciated by the Academy, and I don't know why. None of his films really, except for Rebecca, his first American film, which did win the Academy Award in 1940, I believe. But he was, very, very rare that his films got nominated, or he got nominated, or I think people saw him as sort of this genre guy, or too independent of the Hollywood system. Remember, again, the Academy Award members all worked for studios, and they were very often sort of dictated, who they were supposed to vote for, what was the studio film of the day. So it's hard to understand that. But it was a strong year. But again, it wasn't just the Academy Awards, the Cannes Film Festival. I think it also won awards at the British, the British Academy Awards and things like that. And this was clearly something very unique, very daring. And I think the Academy wanted to show its appreciation and to sort of say, like they did, with Parasite as well, that, we're more than just, popular Hollywood blockbusters. We are supporting the great, art of cinema. And even within the context of this being a studio film, this was something that, again, was quite unusual for its time. And again, that's sort of why I thought it'd be interesting to pick this movie and take a look at it and see what everyone thought.
By the way, you mentioned Ray Milland having the shortest speech in history. Andrew mentioned Hitchcock also had a very short Oscar speech for his Lifetime Achievement Award. And do you remember what it was, Fred? It was 2 words.
No.
Thank you. And that was it. Yeah. Which...
it wasn't a big deal for him. He was never in it for the awards. I mean, that was not Hitchcock at all. So not surprising. Yeah.
So what are we doing next week? It is
okay. So next week again, Best Years of Our Lives. Again, a Best Picture. Incredible cast. Myrna Loy, Frederick March, Dana Andrews. One of the greatest directors of the Hollywood era, William Wyler, who we've not talked about, who I think is an exceptional director, and you certainly can see it in the film. Very interesting. It's a movie where not a whole lot happens. So, this isn't like an action World War II movie. This is really a dramatic film. And it was based on a book, again, as many great films are, that was quite successful. But this was now 47 or 48, and the impact on America of what had happened during World War II and what had happened with these soldiers and what had happened to society in general was very significant. And, we can't quite imagine. I mean, maybe we can, because we've had the pandemic now, right? So, in our lifetime, we've had an experience that in a way was traumatic. And face a lot more people died during this pandemic than died in Vietnam, World War II, and World War I all combined, right? So what is the significance of that, and what has it done, and what does it do to people, and how do people respond, and so I think it's absolutely brilliant. It almost like feels like a novel. It's very novelistic in its approach to material. So can't wait to see what you all have to say. I look forward to seeing you next week. It's not as heavy as this. The best you realize there's a lot of humor in it, and a lot of wonderful love stories, and all sorts of, really, it's the gamut of emotions. So I think you'll enjoy it, and I hope you can join us next week. And until then, I hope you all enjoy the good weather. And who knows, maybe soon we'll move to Orange and we'll be able to have 50 people. And once we do, we'll start doing this at the theater. And until then, of course, you can rent the theater for 10, people, and see your favorite film. And it's not cheap, but it's cheaper than taking 10 people to dinner. So please do that. And in fact, it's booking up pretty rapidly, actually. We're getting quite a bit of success. I don't even know if we have any dates left in March. I think April is starting to book up now. So it's a lot of fun, and you get all the popcorn and soft drinks, and you can safely distance yourselves in the theater, of course. And we try to make that as good an experience as you can. So, and thank you again, Jeff, for all your help with this. It's great fun, and not a fun subject. I promise soon we'll start to get to more fun comedic films, but I thought this was something worthwhile.
Yes, thanks for introducing it to us, Fred, and have a great rest of your week, everyone. Thanks, Fred.
Bye, everybody.
Good evening.